They lead, they enrich, they create, they help. You're listening to The CEOs on News Talk 770. Brought to you by TriView Capital with your host, Angela Kokot.
My CEO this week was born in Montreal, but at the ripe old age of 1, made the very important career move to Calgary. David Gluzman's new home really was the foundation for his success. As a young boy, he was very involved in organized sport, cycling on the Canadian national team in his early teens, and through that experience, he traveled the world. You can't compete in without sampling a little wine. David did more than sample wine. He fell in love with it. However, convincing his North American friends and family proved a little more difficult because of that perception that only wine snobs truly appreciated a fine glass of vino. David was determined to change things, and in 2009, WineCollective was born. I am pleased to welcome the founder and president of WineCollective, David Gluzman, to the CEOs. Good afternoon, David.
Good afternoon.
And right off the bat, we want to be very clear here. This is called the CEO series. He doesn't necessarily have to have the title of CEO, because with WineCollective, who is the true CEO?
It's one of my high school best friends, Matthew Prati. He's our CEO.
And we're going to find out more about WineCollective and how that partnership came to be. But I want you to know right off the bat, every week on Wednesdays, I have Wine Wednesday. And this was not a cheap way of just trying to get more wine. So I want to be clear about that. And David made sure that he came with no wine so that we are not going to be influenced in the next hour. David, you have to tell me, though, I know you were born in Montreal and moved to Calgary at the age of 1. What kind of a kid were you growing up?
Oh boy. So my mom was an artist, so I was always quite creative growing up. And, while going to school, I really enjoyed it for the most part and excelled for the most part during my early years. But I was always very active in sport, really got intrigued by speed skating when I was very young, back right before the Olympics happened. So in 88, 89, I actually started speed skating. So by then I was speed skating and cycling in the summertime and essentially balanced out going to school and being an athlete.
That's a busy little life you were leading as a young kid, though. So what was it, around 13, 14, you had to make a choice on one of those loves, because you did go on to cycle on the national team?
Yeah, at a certain point, I think I was maybe more like 11 or 12 years old. I decided to go full hog onto cycling. I seemed to be a little bit more talented at that than speed skating. Speed skating is hyper technical, whereas cycling, you can be a bit more just all about power and endurance and not worry too much about the technique as much. So yeah, I did the full switch to that, and then I started cycling in Europe right around when I was about 14, 15. That's
pretty incredible for 14, 15. So you're obviously balancing school and competing on a national team. Was there online schooling at that time? I'm just trying to even remember when the sports academies were around in the city.
Well, I actually went to Bishop Carroll High School, which was one of those schools where you could learn at your own pace and whatnot. So I was quite privileged that I managed to get into there, and I got to do some of my school while I was away. But for the most part, my best education, I'd say, was actually traveling the world and being exposed to so much sport.
What else did you gain from that time on organized teams that you then took into your adult life and your business life?
Wow, so much. So, from the basics, goal setting, being driven, really being able to be self-motivated to go out and train as hard as I did back in those times, but also teamwork and really being able to, have respect from my colleagues in terms of sport, but also being able to give respect back to them as well was incredibly important. I remember, for the most part, during my cycling years, I was referred to as being Switzerland every so often because, as you know, in this country, we have Quebecois or French-speaking people, which I'm proud to be a part of, but also the English-speaking Western side of people. And sometimes those groups didn't quite get along. Maybe it was the language barrier or who knows what. But regardless, I would always be in the middle of those two, so I ended up being a bit of a Switzerland in between all that.
And that's obviously something then that you could take into business life when you have to make sure that both sides are getting along.
Absolutely.
All right. I want to know, though, in that time, and maybe it's a coach that's going to pop out, but I'm wondering, when you were growing up, was there someone who you admired, who you looked up to, and why?
Well, I'd like to say it was an athlete, but unfortunately, I don't think it really was. And I think a lot of us have heard about some of the dirt about cycling in recent years and whatnot, so I don't really want to talk too much about that today. But growing up and when I was balancing cycling, I was actually balancing being an entrepreneur at the same time. Back when I was really young, I used to fix computers and build some software, and actually built a little piece of technology for my high school and a couple other high schools to help run their gym classes, for example. But during that time, I actually was fortunate enough to meet and then kind of take under his wing a little bit a fine fellow named David Beresford, who at the time taught me a very important lesson about essentially taking criticism and really trying to knock down my wall as a young kid, saying, look, I'm giving you feedback because I actually care about your success, or I want you to be successful, not because I want to break you down or be disrespectful, which was like a huge important lesson back in the day.
And that's something that, wow, a lot of people can think of, because in situations there is criticism, and depending on how you take that, you either say, oh, this person doesn't want me to succeed or is trying to knock me down, when in fact, no, I'm doing this because I want you to do better.
Absolutely. I think in like the creative world of, design, for example, it's one of those things where you're so proud working on something. It's that's better. It's way easier to, or it's not as easy to be critical about creative work, because for the most part, you're very proud about the work that you've actually done. Whereas, taking feedback and being a creative individual is actually pretty difficult to take on sometimes.
You touch on creative. Your mom's an artist, and it sounds like you were a kid who loved computers and playing around with computers. Where was that influence? Where did that interest come from?
Great question. So I guess, growing up with a mother that was an artist, there was immediate pressure to be like, okay, well, what's your skill? Can you paint? Can you draw? Can you sculpt? What is it? And it was none of those things, obviously. But the neat thing was I was very, very curious during that time about just building things and playing with things. So quite early on, I managed to get a computer and got exposed to the internet roughly when I was around 11 or 12 years old. So this was like the early 90s, before the internet was graphical in any capacity. It was all text-based. And that really kind of unlocked a whole new world for me. I was really, I was really brought into the capability to not just create, but learn anything I really wanted to, which was a whole new world for me. It was probably more of a distraction than anything when it came to like regular school learning, because I felt like, no, those cooler things to learn and play with. So I ended up at one point in time teaching after hours at my high school all the teachers about what was the internet, which was an enlightening, awkward conversation because adult themed stuff obviously came up, and we quickly decided to pass on talking about that.
But you know what? There I am thinking, wait, your mother's an artist and you seem to have a gift for technology. But that's my fault for even thinking that they should be separate. There's such a crossover, especially when we talk about web design, computer design. You've got to have a creative side to that.
Oh, absolutely. It's intertwined. Just like if you were to say user experience isn't design, they are the same thing.
Right. All right, my guest this hour is David Gluzman. He is the founder and president of WineCollective. Want to take a break here. Back with the CEOs after this. David Gluzman is my guest this hour. He is the founder and president of WineCollective. And as we heard, that at the young age of 13, 14, 15, he was cycling on the national team. So you are traveling in Europe a lot. Was that difficult on your family life? I mean, as a child, you're an only child, but still, I'm thinking for parents, and your son is in Europe a lot of the time.
Well, it wasn't. For the most part, like my parents were divorced when I was younger, so it wasn't too big of a thing. And again, being an only child, I had a lot of support from my father, for example, in regards to, he was a proponent part about me actually going to Europe and, really investing full-fledged into it. Because like if you wanted to be a cyclist, you essentially had to be in Europe at the time to do it. But at the same time, during those times, I really leveraged the fact that, again, like I was using the internet remotely from like really terrible internet providers in Italy, for example, and trying to find a phone line I could borrow for 5 seconds to just send my bulk emails off to friends and family. So I made it work.
And that obviously then became your social circle as well, your team. Was that because were you missing friends or any connections back in Calgary during that time?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Like growing up in your teens, right? It's all about your social network
Right.
and who you're hanging out with. And at the time, I actually didn't have a ton of friends because I did travel a lot. So my time during school was like, oh, David's here. Interesting. Wonder where he's been. But being friends with people while I traveled and being on teams across Europe, I made more friends with older people. For the most part, I made some friends with some people out of the UK and Belgium and Italy, of course, because that's where I spent most of my time, and ended up just learning a ton from essentially a different generation or a different complete culture group of people, which was, like I said earlier, a fantastic education on its own.
So what ended your career? Did you decide, all right, I want to move on to my next step? Was it a competitive reality? Why did you finally leave the cycling world?
I don't want to go too deep into the actual reasons, but we'll just leave it at I came back from Europe and some realities kind of hit home. I had a bit of an injury at the time, and unfortunately, I just had to get out of my house and didn't have a lot of money and had to just kind of figure out, okay, well, this is the real world. Let's see if I can actually make a go of it, because I had about $500 to my name and I had to go find an apartment to live at and stuff like that. So just kind of jumped right in.
How old are you at this time?
I probably was about 18 or 19.
Was post-secondary education in the cards for you?
I wanted it to be, but unfortunately I never had the opportunity. So I just decided to keep doing what I had always been doing my entire life, was essentially learn, do, rinse, repeat, and see if it worked. And thankfully today it has worked.
I think it did work out. So in those early days then, you're a young adult on your own, finding your own home, shelter, everything else. What were those early jobs that you had?
Oh, God. So the one that's kind of humorous to talk about now, but was definitely the farthest thing from being humorous at the time, was I essentially was looking through the paper trying to figure out, and you can see this a while ago because I was looking through the paper, for any sort of job. And there was a bunch of jobs which I didn't realize at the time what they were, but essentially it turned out to be door-to-door sales, which was terrifying. But it was a bit of a hammer of reality in terms of like, okay, people do this. There are things such as pyramid schemes, for example. Disgusting. Okay, I don't want to do this. So I did it twice for a day each. But then eventually found a real job, so to speak, which, funny enough, I think I'd mentioned this prior, that had to do with sales. So I worked for one of those big box retailers that sold electronics, ended up selling computers out of essentially, a big store. But the first week or so, they actually take all this time to teach you how to sell. And there's this older gentleman who ran this course, and he was amazing from looking back at it. And the funny thing is, looking back at it now, this was probably one of the most fundamental pieces of entrepreneurial type education that I ever had. And it was working pretty much like a crappy job selling computers.
Right.
But yeah.
But okay, what did you learn from that week of here's how you sell?
Oh, so at the very least, how human beings work on a fundamental level. So one of the basics was when people come in, you ask them if they need help. 9 times out of 10, people would be like, nope.
Yeah.
And then move on. But that's totally normal, right? You need to give people their space. You have to let people feel comfortable. And then when they need help, they'll finally ask you. But the funniest thing is with that, they'll say no and then ask you a question right away after. And you're like, haha, okay. So yeah, the psychology of people, but also the basics of selling, which, for the most part, at least my philosophy that's evolved right now is, get people to actually like you. If people like you, they're probably going to want to do business with you. And I'm not trying to say be artificial, be who you are as a person, but, don't put up this huge facade to try and sell something.
And that comes down to relationships then. And in the last few years of our CEO series, we hear that theme throughout. It all comes down to relationships. No matter how much you know, you didn't go to post-secondary, you don't have a big marketing degree behind you, but you know about people.
Absolutely. And it's all about people, right? It's such a simple thing that has taken me a really long time to really truly believe in.
I like the idea that you're learning from, you say, an old sales guy, because you're in your late teens, early 20s, I'm assuming. And I wonder how many young people out there think, I already know it all. You don't have to tell me anything. But you use that experience to say, I'm going to learn as much as I can from this person?
Yeah, for sure. And, I took that with a vengeance. So, I figured out very quickly that I was actually quite good at selling and excelled at it, which helped me essentially get, grounded in my feet and build up a bit of a savings and manage to, remove the stress of living paycheck to paycheck relatively quickly in my career. Which allowed me to, jump back into everything I wanted to do in terms of entrepreneurial stuff. So get the right equipment to do creative design and computer work and play around with different stuff to continue my learning and get to the next stage of my life.
What kind of computers were you selling? Because how far we've come in computers.
Yeah.
Right?
So this would have been back in the day when just past the 46 days, so like early stage Pentiums and stuff like that. But I took it all the way to, I used to sell computers for like a big box retailer. Then eventually I developed a wholesaler type agreement with different companies to get better prices, and then sold them myself out of my own company and built them from scratch, and then got other people to build them, and then the software, so on and so forth. So it gets pretty nerdy pretty fast.
Well, and with all your nerdy tech background, you still, I'm impressed that you still learn something from an old salesperson. So there's another lesson for young people to learn for sure. So you're working at this sales job, and you start to sound like you're getting into your own wholesale operations or selling from your home. Where do you evolve from there? Because obviously technology has always played a huge part in your life and career.
For sure. And I think, the hardware side of what I did in the early days, in computer hardware to be specific, was a means to an end. It was really easy. It was just about connections and people, and they eventually discovered, David can hook you up with computers, good prices, great stuff, whatever. Right. So I did that. But, at the heart of things for like all the time previous to that, I was always about web design and working on the internet and building things there. So it started to become more of a balancing act of, okay, I'm making enough money so that I can, sell computers to help kind of pay the rent, but then also do creative things on the side as well. So back in about 2001, I started an online magazine called Reading for New Times, which had a lifespan of 10 years, which I was pretty sad to finally be like, okay, it's done. But it's done because WineCollective started really taking off. So it's kind of funny, actually. I'm kind of realizing as I'm telling you and your audience here that my life has been a bunch of stepping stones, and I've kind of jumped from one to the next. And right now I'm on the biggest rock, which feels pretty good. Reading for New Times, what was that? And as you say, then WineCollective came along. So it's on the web, and if you're curious to check it out, it's r4nt.com. And back in the day, it stood for rant. So it was more of a soapbox. It was a very early day blog. And this was, again, way before the word blog even existed. And self-publishing was very difficult. Nothing existed. So I tried to, one, get my opinion out there because, for example, I think one of the first things I wrote about was how I thought ties were silly. And anyway, we won't get into it. But a bunch of other my friends were like really mad at the world, or they wanted to get their opinion heard. So they had a place to all of a sudden publish their thoughts. So I helped do that. Later on, it evolved more into a cultural magazine about music and reviewing stuff, and eventually got into reviewing wine. And if you see this on Facebook and our webpage, which we upload the video to the next day, you will see, in fact, that David is not wearing a tie, so he still thinks, obviously, they're useless. David Gluzman is my guest this hour, and this is the CEOs. He is the founder and president of WineCollective. All right, he touched on WineCollective. How do we get a young kid who was cycling all around Europe interested in wine to the point where he wants to start his own, well, it's almost like a monthly wine club? We'll find out all about that and his journey coming up next. And my guest on this week's CEO series is the founder and president of WineCollective, David Gluzman. We have a young man who is doing fairly well, selling some computers to his friends and word of mouth. And at the same time, though, you are designing different things. You've got your one blog, but were you making money off that blog? Not really, but there was some serious perks to running that blog. So, what were some of those perks? Well, for starters, the learning from it was like, uncomparable, because I had to learn about absolutely everything: hosting, analytics, SEO, SEM, so search engine marketing, stuff like that.
Good, thank you for
more nerdy stuff on the internet, of course.
Right.
But I essentially had to learn about every single piece of doing stuff on the internet. And I had to learn about it very well because I had to run all pieces of it. But also the relationship building and finding other contributors around the world. And then eventually like going to different music festivals in like Austria, for example, like incredible experiences. I got
Those are the perks.
Yeah. Huge perks. And then, in terms of like the technical side of things, it essentially turned into a huge portfolio piece for myself. So eventually, it wasn't really paying the bills, but it helped me get almost every job I ever had since. So working for different creative digital agencies in Calgary, for example, got that fairly certainly because of the work I did with all my work with Reading for New Times. And then, of course, kicking off Wine Collective came out of Reading for New Times as well. So I look back at that 10-year experiment, as I like to call it, of being an incredible learning experience for me and has provided so much, both from the education, technical, and, emotional, looking back at it now.
Are you obviously then a bit of a risk taker? Because, you did have a job on the side. You were saying that you were selling computers and working for some creative web design places. But did you feel this was risky because you were trying to do something else without having a quote-unquote regular job?
It was, and I'll be transparent to say that during the early days of that, like I had one year where I made $6,000 and didn't eat very well, for example. But I look at that time when I didn't make much money as that was my school. So I invested in myself and, became fairly regimented to excel and develop my own skills from everything from the technical side to design side to photography to videography, radio stuff as well, like learning how to actually produce my own podcasts, again, before podcasts were really a thing. I look back at it and it's like, yeah, it was hard, but really good.
Really good. So how does Wine Collective come about? And maybe, first of all, just a definition for people who have never heard of Wine Collective. What is it?
Sure. So the quick elevator pitch is that essentially Wine Collective sources the best wines on the Alberta market every single month. So our staff tastes between 150, 200 bottles of wine in any given month. I know it sounds like hard work. It is.
So much for my Wine Wednesday. All right. 150 wines they sample. How big's your staff?
We've got a handful right now.
I'm doing some division.
Side.
That's a lot of...
Well, the thing is you have to remember that, you're not consuming all those bottles, right? Most time you're sipping and spitting, which, it takes a little while to develop the technique so you don't get it all over yourself and what you're wearing. It's very much work.
So they're sampling all these wines that are available to Alberta consumers and choosing what they think is the best?
Yeah, so we choose essentially the best within certain price points. And as a subscriber, you're essentially subscribing to one of several different packages where you get between 2 to 6 bottles a month sent to your home or office every month. Pardon me. And the idea is the wine that we send you isn't just, it's definitely not plonk, not crappy wine. It's all very highly curated, great product. Varying from geography to varietal, from everything. Everything is just for you to help explore the world of wine, essentially. So we teach you about every wine, where it's from, why we picked it, why it's interesting, and then step you through what it smells like, what it tastes like, and then obviously what it pairs with as well. So every wine comes with this tasting experience package. So you're constantly learning about different wines that you likely would never pick up off the shelf or potentially never find on the shelf.
That's the elevator pitch. But back up, why did you want to have this Wine Collective? Why did you think this was something that was necessary?
Well, a couple reasons. One, back in the late days of Reading for New Times, the magazine, a good friend of mine, Adrian, at the time, really wanted to write about wine. And funny enough, we called it Wine Wednesdays. So there you have it.
Yes.
But
I'm not saying I'm original.
So he would write about wine every Wednesday, and we quickly started getting feedback from the readership going, this wine sounds great, but I can't find it. So, lo and behold, a couple months went by and I was like, I think we've got something here in terms of a different product offering. And lo and behold, Wine Collective was born in late 2008 in terms of the concept, came together with the design and all the technical abilities and launched it in March of 2009.
But when were you first introduced to wine? And I mentioned, of course, your cycling time in Europe, and you can't be in Europe without sampling some wines. But is that when it really began?
Yeah, it did. And I like telling this story because it sounds kind of peculiar, and it definitely is, but it's totally true, is that for a little while when I lived in Italy, I lived in a monastery. That's where the team put us up, which on that alone is a little bit weird. But the monks would actually create their own wine. They had vines and they'd press it. And at lunch and dinner, they'd put out one bottle of red and one bottle of white. And these would be like a liter and change bottles. These were huge. And generally in the evenings, our team would polish off both bottles. So we started getting intimate with the product, so to speak, and developed a bit of a taste for it. But to be perfectly honest, I didn't necessarily fall in love with wine. I was interested in wine. And originally when starting Wine Collective, a bit selfishly, I wanted to have it for myself. I wanted to get rid of the paradox of choice of going into a liquor store, rolling the dice, and randomly picking up a bottle off the shelf that I know nothing about. So by curating the best wine and teaching me about all the best wine, I eventually got really passionate about it. So if you fast forward to, a couple months into it, my palate got a lot better. But it was definitely only due to the team that we had in place to actually make that whole thing happen.
David, I want to take one more break here. David Gluzman, he is our guest, of course. He is the founder and president of Wine Collective. Back with David after this. Finding out all about Wine Collective, and my guest is founder and president Wine Collective. His name is Wine Collective. Well, his friends call him Wine. No, it's actually David Gluzman. But if you were here at the beginning at 2 o'clock, we wanted to say right off the top, just because this is called the CEOs doesn't mean every guest is in fact a CEO. That actually, with Wine Collective, falls to Matthew Proddy. David, tell me your relationship with Matthew and how you both came up with Wine Collective then.
For sure. So Matthew and I go way back. We actually met in high school, and we'd been friends for a long time. And for many years, we had, met up randomly as, he lived in different parts of the world than I did and vice versa. And we always wanted to do business together at some point. And, if you met us today and had a talk with us, we're very much yin and yang. Which is great in a business, because I think you need that to truly be successful, because if you're only thinking down one path, you're probably missing out on something else. So, that's how we kind of came together to really make Wine Collective happen. And, since doing Wine Collective, which still exists, and I recommend you check it out, we've, developed BlackSquare, which is still with the wine industry, but more on the technology side. Matthew's right there alongside with me as well. And he's actually in Vancouver today pitching at like a venture forum. So, we work together very well. And, both of the companies and everything we do wouldn't be what they were without the partnership that we have.
Then give me the traits that Matthew brings to this and the traits that you bring.
Sure. So Matthew has an MBA and has more of an investment banker background. So really good with the financial side of things, numbers guy, great with the financing side, obviously, and also like a good leader and knows how to get things done, which is a quality that I look in anyone that I'm working with. Get things done, please. Thank you. But on the flip side for myself, I think I come to the table more with the creative side of things, product design, product development, technology, so on and so forth. So
you've moved on to BlackSquare, but you say Wine Collective is still going. How do you, and it sounds like, as you say, you've just gone from one little step to another step. At what point did you say, all right, Wine Collective, this is where it's going. I'm comfortable in now venturing out to BlackSquare. Was there any real plan to that evolvement?
Well, all our plans go kicking and screaming. So what kind of happened was we had developed all this technology for ourselves at Wine Collective to automate everything that had to do with running Wine Collective. So, for example, some of the basics would be credit card processing, recurring payments, fulfillment, integrations with couriers, stuff like that. A real pain to deal with on, say, a spreadsheet. So we built all that technology, and eventually we kind of had an aha moment and went, I think we've probably created a product offering for the rest of the wine industry. Let's go out and see if we can sell it. So ended up jumping in the car, drove out to the Okanagan, and essentially went under the guise of telling people about Wine Collective and then also telling people about, oh, well, we have this product that we've built, which we hadn't named, we didn't have a company behind it or nothing. Do you think this would be helpful for you and your organization? And after that trip, we had actually sold the product. So yes, and now BlackSquare and its product, which is called Black Box, is available and being used throughout North America, Asia, Australia, New Zealand, and Europe.
David, I know you are a lover of learning. That's exactly what I'm finding out in this hour, but we want to take one more break here. David Gluzman is my guest. We are back after this. On our CEO series, we love a theme of giving back to communities. And David, of course, as we've found out, very involved in technology. I mean, that's been a common theme throughout your career, David. But when you look at charitable organizations that you support, I guess I shouldn't be surprised that there is a strong technology connection here.
For sure. Well, I think, I've helped run an organization in Calgary called DemoCamp, which has been going on for about, I think, 8 years now with another colleague of mine, Patrick Lohr. And one of the key factors behind doing that has been the tech community in Calgary is always overshadowed by the energy sector here. And I think there's a lot of very talented people that don't actually partake in that industry. And unfortunately, a lot of people that are in the tech world leave Calgary, for example. So I wanted to be a part of something to help educate and give people a community to help share what they're working on, get feedback, try and find co-founders or investment or just a sounding board essentially for this sort of community. So it's been great to see the community grow as much as it has over the years, and I've been very proud to have a little part of it.
DemoCampCalgary.com is that the website that people could go to if there's someone listening saying, I do have something I've been working on? Is that the best way to go?
Yeah, or on Twitter at, I think it's DemoCampYYC.
And so do they meet every couple of months and say, here's what I'm working on, I need some feedback, any ideas on some investment opportunities?
So essentially, if you were working on something and thought, it'd be great to demo this to a group of people, essentially come to the website, say you'd like to demo, send us a brief email, tell us a bit about what you're working on, why it's interesting, and we essentially line you up to pitch. So back in the early days, we used to do them every month. I think we're at the 29th version now, and we don't do them nearly as often. And the reason is because we need community participation to actually warrant getting them to happen. So I encourage anyone that is working on something kind of cool and they want to show it off to please toss their hat in the ring. And we generally now are doing them about every quarter.
And, I remember a couple of months ago, and Trent Johnson's a name that's coming off, and he's very involved in technology and stuff. And we had him on as a guest because exactly what you're saying. Too often, our province looks at, okay, we're all about oil, energy, and here's another sector that is being ignored. But really, we're losing a lot of brain power to the U.S., to Silicon Valley.
Absolutely. And I think a really easy comparison is take a look at, say, Houston, Texas. Right? Obviously very similar to Calgary or Alberta. They were very, very energy driven. And if you fast forward to today, if I could talk, they are very heavily invested in the tech community as well. So they took that leap, and I don't know the specifics of how that happened, right, unfortunately, but I should know because it's a pretty interesting story. No,
you're too busy operating all your different companies here, it seems. Wine Collective, though, also, that's David Gluzman, your charitable interests, but Wine Collective as well has been very involved with different charities.
Absolutely. We've done a lot of stuff to help support stuff like MS, AIDS, rebuilding the zoo after the flood, stuff for ARCs, for dogs, and several others. We have a page on the website if you're curious to see more.
Even in the 2009, let's say, Wine Collective really got off the ground, even in that 5-6 year span, what have you seen when it comes to the delivery of wine, the ease of it? Because, we sometimes still say, I can't even sometimes bring wine from BC. So are you seeing changes in that way when you're able to get different products into your members' hands?
It's a hot topic.
Yeah.
And, a couple of years ago, the federal government passed a bill called Bill 311, I believe it is, that essentially said that interprovincial shipment of wine was now legal.
Mm-hmm.
And this is bringing back like a prohibition era law. So the thing is, right now, federally it is legal. Provincially, it really depends on the province. So we have seen a lot of changes happening. There's a lot of push on Twitter, for example. Is like a BC Wine Chat hashtag that happens, I believe, every week, where people talk about what's happening in the BC landscape. And essentially, we need to start treating wine less as a prohibition era type product. It just isn't.
But even saying that, Wine Collective, you have members not just in Alberta, right? You have members all over, don't you?
Wherever it's legal for us to ship.
That's it. Ah, okay. Because I was saying, is that a barrier then sometimes when it comes to people being part of what sounds like a great opportunity to try a bunch of different wines?
No, absolutely. And if you look at, say, the wine producers of Canada, right? You've got two major regions, BC and Ontario, and then you do have some in the Maritimes, for example. We do not have any vineyards in Alberta. Sorry, it's too cold. But it's unfortunate that we have free trade across North America, but unfortunately we are still dealing with some of the politics of being able to enjoy Canadian-made product across the provinces of Canada. So this is an ever-changing thing that's been happening, but it's still not cut and dry.
You're all of 35, it almost sounded like I said all of, but you are all of 35 years old. Where does David Gluzman see himself in another 10, 15 years?
Always a hard question to answer. Not to say I live day by day. I don't. But, for me, I'm very passionate about creating great user experiences. And I think you can see that with what we've done in the wine industry, that, we want to make it modern, easy, and just a great experience. And I think, wherever I'm going to be in, say, 5-10 years or whatnot, I may still be doing what I'm doing in the wine industry. And, that's been our MO for a while. Like BlackSquare's motto in the early days was, "We are the wine revolution." We've toned it down since then, but at the heart, that's what we've always been saying. So, whether in 10 years we're still revolutionizing the wine industry, or, I'm doing something else, I'm quite passionate about, what my wife is involved with in terms of healthcare. And I hear a bunch of stuff that happens in the healthcare industry. And I look at that as being like, wow, there could be a lot of user experience improvements in healthcare.
So you'll always have technology. And when you look at going back to that young kid in high school teaching his teachers about the internet, does it kind of blow your mind how far we have come with technology?
Not so much. It's actually pretty refreshing that, I placed the right bet, I think. So I'm pretty happy with where things are at.
You have done very well. David, thank you very much for sharing some time with us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
David Gluzman, he is president and founder of Wine Collective, but as you have heard, that is just one small part of David. We've got news coming up next.